So I'm going to share with you some basics about clinical trials. And first of all, I'll tell you a little bit about the organization that I work for. It's called Clinical Trials Ontario, or you might hear me just refer to it as CTO. And CTO is mostly funded by the province of Ontario, the government of Ontario. And you can read about the vision and the mission, but basically it really is to make Ontario a better place to do clinical trials. As Kathy mentioned, my role is the engaged strategic priority. So it's really to help people understand more about clinical trials, help them make decisions about trials that make the most sense for them, and also help them contribute to clinical trials if they'd like to do that. The other two strategic priorities are that we help streamline the processes around clinical trials while maintaining their high quality nature. And we promote Ontario as a place to do clinical trials. I want to take this opportunity to note that while I work for a provincially based organization, clinical trials are nationally regulated. So everything that I will talk about today applies to clinical trials all across Canada. So tonight, I'm going to give you some basic information about clinical trials, how they work and why we do them, and some information that might be helpful if you're considering participation. Everything that I will talk about is on CTO's website. This is a screenshot of it, and I can share the link in the chat when I finish talking. It's important for me to let you know that all of the public-facing information under the Patients and Public tab of our website has been co-created with patients as partners. So the whole idea there is to help make that information more relevant, easier to digest for people, and hopefully it's the type of information that they're looking for. So what are clinical trials? They are a type of research, and that's important for people to know that they're a type of experiment, and it's one that involves people. The second thing to know is that clinical trials test what we call health-related interventions. Intervention is a fancy word for therapy or treatment, and along with testing that treatment or therapy, we test its outcomes in people. And we answer specific questions with clinical trials. We're going to talk a little bit about that later. They're designed to answer specific questions. And so we often use them to answer questions like, is the treatment safe? Does it improve or even maybe cure disease? Or does it help people live longer with disease than treatments that are already available? And does it help people feel better? Does it improve their quality of life? Does it help them do the things that they want to do? And I think that many people often think about clinical trials with respect to drugs, and we're going to talk mostly about them with respect to drugs, but there are other treatments that are studied in clinical trials. And sometimes they're studied on their own, sometimes they're studied in combination with others. And so we've got listed here drugs. It might be something like a medical device, like for example, an insulin pump that would be tested in a clinical trial. Might be a new type of surgery that's maybe compared to a surgery that's already out there. Might be a type of radiation therapy. It might be a new diagnostic procedure or some type of imaging. And it can be things like diet and lifestyle. So it might be a specific formulation of some type of food supplement, might be an exercise study. So really, it can be a lot of things in addition to drugs. So you might be thinking, well, big what? Why do we actually do clinical trials? And that's a good question. So we do them to provide evidence or data around the intervention that's being tested. And that evidence or data that's generated really helps us to decide what therapies or other interventions might work best for people. So this data that's generated gives a lot of different people the opportunity to make decisions about interventions. So it might be the specific investigator or researcher who's doing a study, or maybe it's a company, so a sponsor. And the data from the clinical trial might help them decide if they're actually going to continue studying that intervention or not, for a variety of reasons. The data might be used, for example, by Health Canada or other regulators to make decisions around what are safe and efficacious interventions. Might help decision makers and policymakers decide, what's covered on provincial formularies. And I know that Louise is going to talk a bit about the policy side of things. And it might also help healthcare providers decide how to treat their patients or have conversations about what therapies are available to people. So just through a clinical trial, lots of different people have access to data that can help them make decisions in different ways. So even though we can think about interventions for clinical trials that are studying clinical trials being different things, I'm just going to focus, for the sake of simplicity, on the phases of clinical trials when we're developing a drug. So a drug that starts in phase 1 may or may not make it through this pipeline, and that depends on the data that's collected at each of the phases and whether that's considered successful or not. Or maybe it's related to funding and other things. But we'll generally look at these 4 different phases. And you can see that they involve different numbers of people. They will often take different amounts of time. And as I mentioned before, we design studies so that they answer specific questions. So let's take a closer look at each of these phases. So phase 1, these studies are done in small numbers of people. This phase you may also hear referred to as first in humans or first in man. And maybe that's not appropriate. Let's go back to first in humans. And so it's done a small number of people because this is literally the first time that the drug is tested in people. Important to keep in mind that while these individuals are taking a bigger risk, because this is the first time the drug is taken by people, often for a number of years, the drug is studied in a preclinical phase. So it's studied at the bench for many years. It's studied using specific cell lines, might be studied in a number of different animals as well. So we generally have a good idea of how it will behave, but we never know until we put it into people. So as I mentioned, these people are taking a slightly bigger risk participating in studies because this is the first time that the drug has been given to people. So we're really looking here at safety, a bit about dose, and obviously side effect. Usually phase 1 studies are done in what's called healthy individuals. So they might not have the disease that's under study that the drug is for, but that depends. And I'm going to speak about each of these phases and kind of the generalities, but there can be some different circumstances around the different phases as well, depending on the drug that's studied, the disease it's for, a number of different reasons for that. So small number of participants, usually these aren't very long studies, and these individuals are really closely monitored. And that's important to know that in clinical trials, the people who participate are closely monitored and carefully followed. So if the people doing this study take a look at the data and it's deemed that phase 1 has been successful, it may or may not move on to phase 2. Like I said, for a number of reasons. Could be funding, could be a number of decisions that are made. If it does move on to phase 2, these are studies that happen in a slightly larger number of people. Usually these happen in people who are living with the condition for which the drug is intended. And here, the goal is to look at the efficacy. So basically, does the drug do what it's supposed to do in people living with that condition. And throughout the different phases, we learn more about the dose, and we learn more about the side effect profile of the drug in this case. So these are done in a larger number of participants, phase 2. Sometimes you'll hear it's phase 2A, phase 2B. Sometimes you hear it's a combined phase 1-2. So that's what I was mentioning, that there can be some different things that happen between the phases as well. And this might take a longer amount of time, partially because you're recruiting a larger number of people to the study. So let's assume that our hypothetical drug meets its phase 2 endpoints and moves on to a phase 3 study. So phase 3 studies happen in larger numbers of people. Again, here participants are assigned by chance to one of the interventions, and that random assignment is done to reduce bias when we look at the outcomes related to the interventions. Here we're looking to see how long the effects of the drug last. And like in the other phases, we're continuing to learn more about the proper dose and the side effects of the drugs, of the drug as well. It's for a larger number of participants, and partially because of that, these may take longer to recruit for and to complete. When you hear the acronym RCT, that stands for Randomized Controlled Clinical Trial, and that's when 2 or more interventions or so-called treatment arms are compared against each other. So those are phase 3 studies. They're often referred to as a gold standard in terms of the evidence that they produce. After phase 3 studies in Canada, a sponsor or investigator can apply to Health Canada for so-called market authorization. And so they can apply for it to be marketed broadly and approved, what we consider approved in Canada. So phase 4 clinical trials happen after market authorization. And so this is basically when the drug is on the market, and it now has a chance usually to be used in many cases by thousands of people. Depends on the indication though. So like in a rare disease, that's not going to be tens of thousands of people. But for this reason, it's also often called post-marketing surveillance. So it's after the drug has been formally approved to be on the market by the regulator. And this is where we look at the drug in a large number of people. And this provides us the opportunity to look not only at the long-term side effects, so phase 4 studies can go on for many years, but we also just can see in large numbers of people how the drug performs, so to speak. So these are for very large numbers of participants. Okay, so that's kind of the basics about the phases of clinical trials for drugs. As I mentioned, while something might start in phase 1, it may or may not make it to market. It really depends on how the data look throughout the studies. So part of a person's decision, if they're thinking about participating in a clinical trial, is no one really can tell you if a clinical trial is right for you. That's a really personal decision. You might lean on healthcare providers or family or friends to help you make that decision. But really, that's a personal decision for you to make. These are some of the things that we think are important for you to know in terms of making that decision. So the first point is that a couple of red flags about clinical trials is if you're ever asked to cover the cost of the study treatment or to pay for the healthcare providers to provide you with the treatment, or almost like an entrance fee for a study. I answered a question a couple of weeks ago for someone who was asked literally for thousands of dollars for access to the study treatment, and that really should not be happening at all. In the cases of clinical trials, the costs for the clinical trial should be covered. There might be some out-of-pocket things that you have to pay for. Maybe you have to drive to the site. Maybe you have to pay for parking. maybe you have to take a day off work, so to speak, but you would not be required to pay for the study treatment. So that's something that's really important. Another thing that you should look at is the qualifications of the clinical trial team. So for example, has the principal investigator been working in this area for many years, or are they a specific specialist, or do they maybe have ties with an academic center? Important that the clinical trial application in Canada has to have been reviewed and approved by Health Canada to take place in Canada. It might seem like a weird question to ask, but it's totally within your rights to ask if the trial application has been reviewed by and approved by Health Canada. It also needs to be reviewed and approved by a research ethics board. So as an example, if the site at which you're considering the study, like if it's a hospital site, it has to have been reviewed and approved by that hospital's research ethics board. Again, completely good for you to ask that question. And the clinical trial also has to be reviewed and approved by the institution or the organization where it's taking place, because ultimately they're responsible for what happens within their premises. So if you feel satisfied with all of those things and you're interested in the study, you also have to meet what's called the eligibility criteria to be in the clinical trial. And I'm briefly going to talk to you about what that means. So you can think of the eligibility criteria as kind of like the qualification set that determines whether or not you can participate in the trial. So some of the examples you can think of are, you might have to live with a specific disease or condition. You might have to be within a certain age range to participate. You might have to be close to a specific location because there might be a number of visits that you have to go for. You might have to be a specific ethnicity, and there may be other eligibility criteria, but those are some examples for you. In addition to eligibility criteria, you might hear inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so inclusion criteria is the characteristics that are needed to be part of the trial. So an example here might be within a cancer clinical trial, you might have to have specific genetic characteristics, for example. And lastly, exclusion criteria. These are characteristics that don't allow your participation in a trial. And these are often, I'll say, to make the data cleaner, for lack of better words. So for example, pregnant women or pregnant individuals are often excluded from participating in clinical trials because the condition of pregnancy can really affect how they might respond to an intervention, or having other specific health conditions might exclude you from participating. So in my case, for example, the COVID-19 vaccine trials, people with specific immunocompromised conditions were actively excluded from the vaccine studies because of the medications we were on, and that might have an impact on how the vaccination would impact us. So those are a few examples. We often get asked, if my healthcare provider offers me a trial, do I have to participate? And the answer is no, you don't have to. So they might bring a trial to you if they know that you're interested in trials or they think might be a good fit for you. But as I mentioned earlier, it's a really personal decision that ultimately is your decision to make. And this should not affect the care that you receive. It doesn't matter what your decision is, your care should remain the same with your healthcare provider. Another thing that I'd like to talk to you about is the concept of informed consent. And many people think informed consent is signing a piece of paper and consenting to be part of a study. And it's actually much more than that. So it is an active, ongoing process. Consent is voluntary, and you can withdraw that consent at any time, even if you've agreed, obviously, earlier to be part of a study. It is an ongoing process, so you should be actively updated throughout the study, and you should feel free to ask any questions that you need answered as you're part of the study. If you do decide to withdraw consent, so leave a trial, you can also request the withdrawal of your data and any biological materials that you provided. And depending on the study, that may or may not be possible, but you can certainly request that. So also important to know about withdrawal. So as I mentioned, you can end your participation at any time in a clinical trial without needing to provide a reason. You might be asked for a reason, but you don't need to provide one. You are encouraged to make sure you talk to the study team about your decision. So maybe they can answer questions and help walk you through making that decision, or maybe they can reassure you about things and you change your mind, and that's okay too. You might be asked for questions about your experience in the study, and you might be asked to have specific lab tests or physical exams for the intent to help you safely stop the study. And again, you can ask for information that was collected about you or samples that were collected from you to be withdrawn from the study. But as I mentioned, that may or may not be possible. So I think that's it for me. I just wanted to leave you with, we're happy for you to visit our website. Everything, again, that I provided to you this evening is under the patients and public pages. It is available in both English and French, and I am always happy to be contacted after the fact. I know some people will have questions here, but I like to leave my email address. I'm always happy for people to contact me and answer any questions you might have after the webinar as well. So thanks a lot.